If there's one thing I've learned over the years that I think is like really true, it's that if you don't do the Middle East, it does you.
Welcome to the TCF World Podcast, episode 10. This is Thanasi Kambanis in Beirut, and today I'll be talking to Dina Esfandiary from the King's College War Studies Department, and then later after the break with Bruce Jentleson from Duke University about their work as part of TCF's Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East project. Dina, thanks for agreeing to come on the TCF World Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the details of the report you wrote for TCF, you were looking at Iran and the country's security relationship with its neighbors, and I want to hear your take on the continuing brouhaha over the Iran deal and the debate over whether to decertify it or tear down the deal altogether. How is Iran viewing all this talk in the U.S.?
I think Iranian officials are. I mean, obviously they've gotten used to the idea now, but I think originally they were a bit surprised at the idea that we were going to be relitigating the Iran nuclear deal almost more than 2 years down the line from it. The entire negotiation process for all of those involved was a pretty painful process. It lasted about a little bit longer than a decade. And the last round really took it out of the negotiators. And the deal that was reached really was the only achievable deal that would leave everybody relatively unhappy with the result, which means that actually everybody is likely to continue implementing it, because if one party walks away happy, then obviously it doesn't work.
So, I mean, from the U.S. perspective, and I think from the European perspective as well, when the deal was being negotiated, there was a lot of discussion on ignoring secondary sources of tension with Iran and focusing on the primary issue of the nuclear program. And since Trump came into power, his rhetorical presentation of this deal, and he's not alone, by the way, in his administration of taking this position, is that somehow this is a great deal for Iran. So aside from the argument that it's a terrible deal for the U.S., the claim is that this is just a great deal for Iran, from the sanctions opening and relief that it brought them to security assurances. How does that look from Iran's perspective? I mean, how good a deal is it from Tehran's point of view?
Well, again, the Iranians are pretty surprised at these statements, because from Iran's perspective, this isn't exactly the best deal it could have gotten. Iran had to give up quite a lot. It had to reverse track on a lot of its nuclear program, and has had a lot of constraints put on it that other states have not seen in terms of the intrusiveness of the verification measures that were decided upon on the nuclear deal. And of course, what it got in return, which was supposed to be comprehensive sanctions relief, has really not been as comprehensive as it was promised. So the Iranians haven't gotten...
Well, how comprehensive has it been? I mean, I'm interested in that, because I think there's a lot of either assumptions or exaggerations about the alleged windfall for Iran.
It hasn't been a windfall. It's as simple as that. I mean, yes, European and other unilateral sanctions have been lifted. UN sanctions, of course, only nuclear-related sanctions have been lifted. But US sanctions were only suspended. And of course, the uncertainty that President Trump is creating with all of the negative statements he's making towards Iran, his very aggressive anti-Iran stance, is making businesses even outside of the US quite nervous about perhaps re-entering the Iranian market if they have any exposure to the U.S. market, because that just means that they would put themselves at risk of having sanctions slapped on them further down the line.
And is Iran part of been reintegrated in the international banking system?
It has into the international banking system. No, it has not, because a lot of medium and especially larger international banks and European banks still refuse to have anything to do with Iran. A lot of the smaller banks are now trading and processing payments for Iran, but usually these are banks that have no exposure to the U.S. market.
And I guess you're implying that there hasn't been a tide of fresh foreign investment, because even though some things are now possible that weren't before, none of the multinationals that really could bring in, come in and build refineries, let's say, or major factories are willing to take the risk, given that this might all be reversed overnight.
Exactly. So initially you had a great deal of interest, particularly on the part of European companies, even major European companies. And you had companies like Total who went into Iran, even signed a deal with the Iranians, who just last month or 2 months ago came out and said, well, if President Trump continues on the current path that he's on, we're going to have to reevaluate our deal to help the Iranians develop their gas fields, because it would leave us open to potential future sanctions. So even the major investments and the major businesses that Iran needs are refusing to go into the country at the moment because of this uncertainty.
So pulling back to talk about the subject of your report for Order from Ashes, and I think it's probably a thread that unifies a lot of your work, is trying to understand the regional security balance from Iran's perspective. So, this isn't an exercise in apologetics or justification, but just in understanding how today's unstable Middle East looks from Iran's perspective. How do you assess this picture of Iran as the great bugbear in the Middle East, the sort of interventionist power that is behind a plethora of asymmetrical guerrilla groups, that is destabilizing rivals in the Gulf and backing problematic or spoiler actors in Yemen and Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and so forth? What's your view of how this playing field looks from Iran's perspective?
So there's no doubt that Iran is conducting a lot of nefarious activities in the region. Nobody is questioning that. The point is that when you look at it from Iran's perspective, a lot of what it does is, just like any other country, is intended to guarantee its own security and its borders. So Iran just does it differently to other states because it doesn't have the conventional means at its disposal that perhaps other countries have, because it's been under sanctions for the last, 20, 30 odd years. So Iran sees a lot of what it does in the region through the prism of protecting itself. For example, its involvement in Syria and in Iraq is intended to ensure that a lot of the violence that occurs in those countries stays in those countries, particularly in Iraq, and doesn't spill over into Iran. It's intended to ensure that Iran continues to have influence as far as Lebanon and can continue to reach its proxy in Lebanon. So Iran doesn't necessarily see a lot of what it's doing in the region as aggressively as perhaps its neighbors on the other side of the Persian Gulf do. It really does see it from a defensive perspective. The only exception to that, perhaps I would say, is Iran's involvement in Yemen. And I would caveat that because I would say, firstly, that Iran's involvement in Yemen is not as intense as it has been pictured to be. Iran's relationship with the Houthis is not like its relationship with Hezbollah, for example. It's a lot looser, and the Houthis don't necessarily always listen to Iranian advice. Having said that, the Iranians are involved in the country not because they have any interests at stake, but because the Gulf Arabs have painted Iranian involvement in Yemen out to be such a huge deal for them that for Iran it's a very low-cost way of poking the Gulf Arabs, and Saudi Arabia in particular, in the eye. So I would say that that's the only arena where Iran is almost doing it gratuitously because it can, and because it allows it to have a little bit of leverage over the Gulf Arabs.
It seems to me that there's a real conflicting strains in Iran's policy in the region, and the first strain is the one I think you're describing, certainly in the paper that we're releasing today, is Iran looking at a very turbulent neighborhood in which there are a lot of let's say expansionist powers and often U.S.-backed militant movements that are threatening core Iranian interests, and so Iran is looking to secure itself against hostile encroachment. And this is something that can explain its response to the war with Iraq in the 80s and with to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the later U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and so on. That's one way of looking at it. Now, the other is the expansionist, revolutionary foreign policy that's also been part of Iran's approach to the region. And this is, in a way, almost like American foreign policy, right? A sort of exceptionalist, interventionist approach to the affairs of its neighbors that has a deep ideological dimension. And this is something that we see in the relationship, certainly with Hezbollah, and maybe with some of their more like-minded local partners in Iraq. And I'm interested in whether those are simply two threads of essentially of a realist foreign policy, or whether those are actually two competing approaches within Iran's establishment to relations with the region and to a sort of fundamental view of what a secure neighborhood would look like for Iran.
So I would argue it's a little bit of both. I think there are two threads of Iranian foreign policy because these are the two threads that Iran, the Islamic Republic, kind of created when it first secured power in Iran, and particularly spreading the revolution became one of the fundamentals of the Islamic Republic at the beginning. But today, these two threads do conflict with one another. And the reason for that is that Iran finds itself acting outside its borders, but in what it views as a defensive mechanism. And it certainly doesn't see itself trying to spread its ideology in the region anymore. But others do, because Iran, and under Khomeini, when he first came to power, carried this very strong, we are going to spread the revolution in the region, and we are going to lead the Islamic world. And so today, it actually faces some of the consequences of that policy back then, in that no matter what it does in the region, it's viewed aggressively in a hegemonic manner and as a country that's trying to spread its ideology. But Iran, actually, one thing it does do is it aims to lead all Muslims in the region. And of course, ideologically, Iran is a Shia Muslim state, which is actually a minority, of course, in the region. And so it doesn't make sense for Iran to just advance the interests of the Shias, because if it does so, then it would never be able to lead all Muslims in the region. So this idea that Iran is peddling Shia Islam and trying to take over the Sunnis in the region doesn't make sense from an Iranian perspective, because if it does that, then it won't have as much support in the region. So again, the fact that it has this ideology, that it's been trying to spread this ideology, today is coming around and making it very difficult for Iran to lead the regional policy that it hopes to lead.
In closing, one implication I take from what you've said and what you've written is that at least one approach to calming the tensions in the region that revolve around the sort of Iranian-Saudi struggle for preeminence would be to make moves that reassure Iran from a raw security vantage point. What are some practical measures that either countries in the region or that Europe and the U.S. could take to reassure Iran in a way that would lead it to calm down some of the moves that have so aggravated other powers?
So I think the first most important thing that any country that deals with Iran could do would be to tone down their anti-Islamic Republic rhetoric. So that's when I say this in particular with regards to the U.S. and to Saudi Arabia, and knowing that perhaps it's already too late for that to happen, because I think with everything that's coming out of the United States at the moment and the Trump administration, I'm not sure that the Iranian establishment believes that the U.S. will ever want anything other than regime change in Iran.
But does rhetoric matter that much, given that we saw Obama really softening the rhetoric of the Bush years and then Trump ramping it back up? Did those changes in U.S. tone result in changes in Iranian policy or behavior?
They don't result in changes in Iranian behavior, but they do result in changes in Iran's willingness to engage with the U.S. and with even its own neighbors. When you look at the statements that have come out of the U.S. and the way that the Iranians take it, you have people like the supreme leader that comes out and says, well, guys, I told you there was no point in engaging with the U.S. because, look, we engaged with one administration, the next one comes along, and this is what he says, and now our nuclear agreement is at risk. So it doesn't exactly foster goodwill within the Iranian establishment. Now, having said that, I also think it's important for Iran to reassure its neighbors, and this, we're talking about regional security now. It's important for Iran to reassure its neighbors as well. It can't just be a one-way road. The reassurance can't just be coming towards Tehran. It has to come out of Iran as well. And one key way that Iran could do that is by discussing the Yemen issue with its partners, if they were willing to sit down with it. Because, of course, one of the things that the Gulf Arabs do say is that Iran shouldn't be present in Arab affairs to begin with, so there's no reason for us to have discussions on a country like Yemen. But again, Yemen could be the olive branch that Iran could extend to its neighbors because it's not a really important issue for Iran, and it's an order of high importance for the Gulf Arabs.
Well, we'll have to leave it there because we're out of time, but there's a lot more we could talk about. Dina, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
We were talking with Dina Esfandiary, a fellow at the War Studies Department at King's College London. She's also an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Next up, we'll be talking to Bruce Jentleson at Duke University. Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East is a multi-year TCF project supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. TCF experts are studying new ways to manage conflict and promote stability. You can order the book and read the reports on our website. Go to tcf.org and look for the Arab Regional Security page. This is Thanasi Kambanis. I'm joined now by Bruce Jentleson, a professor of public policy and political science at Duke University, who also served as a senior advisor to the State Department in 2009 to 2011. Bruce, thanks for coming on the TCF World podcast.
Happy to be with you.
In your report that's out today as part of Order from Ashes, you took on the sort of fundamental question of how the U.S. the Middle East, and you sort of try to get beyond the critique of what's wrong with the current approach. I just finished talking to Dina Esfandiary about the view of the current regional power struggle from Iran's perspective. Now, when you did your exercise of how to rebalance U.S. policy, let's start with Iran. What's your view of the correct way for the United States to understand Iran and the threat it poses?
You know, I think we've fallen into the politics of the enemy way too much in our own kind of talking about, inside the Beltway and beyond discourse on Iran. Everybody has to, punch the ticket that I'm tough, I'm a hawk. And we both know there's plenty of reasons that validate that, and that Iran's, aggression and adventurism in the region, its role in the Iraq War, and all those sorts of things were not just functions of bad American policy. It has to do with Iran trying to sort out its role. But my sense is that, you really also have to try to see what possibilities are there for serious improvement in the relations. I understood the political constraints during the Obama years of feeling that traffic could barely bear the JCPOA. But I was concerned even before Trump won that one agreement couldn't possibly carry the weight of the overall relationship, that inevitably things would happen and it would be vulnerable, and that you really wanted to look for opportunities, whatever your mechanism, track two, quiet diplomacy, to really explore, because I do think, we can talk about this more, that both sides have interests in a serious improvement in relations. And if it's not possible, find that out. But I think we kind of dismiss it out of hand rather than really test it to see what might be possible.
Well, and it seems like one of the underlying impulses in American foreign policy thinking, which actually connects the Obama era to the Trump era, is this feeling, and I say it's more a feeling than a concrete idea, that we're just wasting too much thought and energy on the Middle East entirely, and that we have this sort of exaggerated sense of how much it matters to our core interests. Do you think the amount of time and energy and lives and material that we spend on Middle East policy is proportional or commensurate to its actual share of the U.S. national interest?
Well, I used to have these discussions with my friends, in the Obama administrations, who wanted the rebalance, the pivot. Of course, Asia is incredibly important, whether it's the size of markets and growing middle class or the challenges of China. But I often say to them that the problem with the Middle East, if there's one thing I've learned over the years that I think is like really true, it's that if you don't do the Middle East, it does you, right? Now, that doesn't mean you have to go, make major ventures like the Bush invasion of Iraq, or constantly feel that it's about containment and covert operations and, siding with countries just because you have a shared enemy. So what it really is not so much how much attention you pay as to what the quality of your strategy is. And I do think there's a way of dealing with the Middle East that a lot of the articles in your book and my own as well try to get at that doesn't require as much bandwidth or resources, but gets beyond the notion of, we need to pay attention. We have to, the Middle East is in addition to, not instead of, other regions important to U.S. interests.
And am I right in understanding the central idea in your approach to be one where a sort of version of offshore balancing, where we try to keep all the different competing interests and problems in the Middle East in balance with each other, so none of them can become big enough to be a global problem without getting so entangled that we're trying to manage and solve any of these problems ourselves?
Yeah, I start with the basic question that any strategist should start with is, what are our interests? And it's never a pure whiteboard exercise. But we have lived, as you said at the outset, there are so many things changing and flaws in American strategy long before Trump made it even worse. It's one of those periods of transition and a lot's in flux. And so two of the points that I try to bring out is, one is enough of the notion, we must support our traditional allies. You really got to ask the question of, are our interests as convergent with, for example, Saudi Arabia, as they might have been when we were heavily dependent on their oil right after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the like. I don't think they are, number one. And the Saudis will pursue their own interests in ways that are in conflict with ours and sort of reverse leverage. So one thing is to really rethink the relations with traditional allies. The other is to realize that it's not about American retreat or are we leaving the region, things that you and I and others heard from Sunni Arab leaders so much because Obama was trying to shift to different strategies. The Russians and the Chinese have interests in the region, and countries have interests in relations with them, whether they're economic or, partially some form of military cooperation. And I actually think we need to think of our relation with the other major global powers as a mix of competition, still there, collaboration when we can, and ironically, a little bit of complementarity. To the extent that some of these countries contribute to stabilization or other aspects of the region, we may actually derive some benefits, even though somehow we feel like they're bigger players. But it's not a region that's going to belong to one or another country. There's no way the Russians are going to get hegemony in the region, or the Chinese. And it's a very pragmatic approach for us. Countries will want to have relations with us, but let's get out of this notion that somehow it's zero sum with whatever's good for Russia or China is automatically not good for us.
How do we take into account the politics of these foreign policy choices? Because you raise a point that I think is very compelling in a sort of cerebral exercise where we can look at our close allies. And you didn't mention Israel just now, but you did in the report you wrote. That's another one of the close allies with whom our relationship is sort of distorted and out of kilter with our actual interests. So you take these problematic friends the U.S. has in the region, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, just to name the three most sort of biggest energy hogs, and you can, as you do, compellingly make an argument that they don't matter to us as much as we act like they do, and we'd be much better served with a sort of arm's length relationship. But what about the political dividends that come with things like Trump's shift to the right on Israel, or Trump's embrace of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, these sort of moves that are, in my view, at a minimum, designed for theatrical domestic political impact in a way that works for what it's intended, even if it causes a lot of problems down the road for our foreign policy.
Yeah, I think on the general point about MBS and Saudi Arabia and Arab allies in general. I mean, underlying the America first, there is an element that's bash the foreigners in so many ways that's pretty awful in every sense. But I don't think the debate anymore is strictly about who's tough enough. I think there's a pragmatism. I did some work over the years with my academic hat on, what I call the pretty prudent public, that kind of wants to understand that they don't want you to be totally knee-jerk, and they don't want you to be totally gun-shy. And over 60% of the public gets it that we have to have some role in the world. That's from Chicago Council on Global Affairs surveys. So I think the public is open to a pragmatism, and it's less, arm's length than it is saying, hey, MBS is pursuing all these policies. Trump leaves and he picks a fight with Qatar, where we have a major base and other relations. He basically kidnaps the prime minister of Lebanon. He and, people before him drew us further into the Yemen war. I mean, hello? Is that really in our interest? And so I think you can make an argument that gets beyond, frankly, the inside the beltway notion of we have to do, everything is about, American leadership. I think the Iraq War had major impact about, at a time where everybody was pulling together after 9/11, dramatically overplaying your hand. So I actually think that you can redefine those questions in ways that reach the average person. And the reality, from my experience in politics, is you don't need 55, 60% support for a lot of the policies we're talking about, short of committing troops. What you have to avoid is 55 to 60% opposition. And that gives you a lot of running room there that allows you to make the adjustments with manageable political consequences. The Israel question has its own politics. And I think there it's really been, I think the Obama administration mismanaged it. I think that when Obama was reelected, Bibi Netanyahu had overplayed his hand by betting the House on Romney. In the Israeli election, he was still in power, but he didn't do as well. And I always felt Secretary Kerry made a mistake by allowing Netanyahu and Abbas to think that he wanted peace more than they did. There's a whole generational change going on in the United States, in the American Jewish community, that I think is not BDS and all that sort of thing. That's not what I'm seeing among students and others, but is ambivalent about Israel. And, you have things like Israeli retired heads of the Mossad and generals being much more pragmatic than Bibi. I'm not persuaded that, that AIPAC is as powerful as it's made out to be. I remember when Rabin was, even before Oslo, when he came to the United States, when he was first elected prime minister in 92, and he gave a speech to AIPAC, and he said, I'm tired of you thinking you know Israel's interests better than mine. And, you got some problems in Congress. You have some of your fundraising things, but, we're in an age right now where you take those things on, and if people believe you're being authentic, I say all that believing that we must maintain a commitment to Israel's genuine security, but it doesn't mean we have to agree with everything they do. And people. I don't think I'm being naive. I've been around the block enough times on the political side to think that this is really where the politics of Israel are at. They're not totally where Trump has sort of been trying to take them.
It seems like if we follow the kind of analysis and prescriptions that you're making, it would encourage American policymakers to take a less emotional and moralistic approach to the struggles in the Middle East, and to think more about questions like managing regional conflict and increasing security, rather than picking a winner or turning back Iranian influence entirely, and instead seeking to manage these forces while acknowledging that they're all gonna stay present. And the place, one of the places where I see us really moving in the opposite direction is on Israel-Palestine, with the moves from the Jerusalem recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, the threats to UNRWA, and the embrace of the Israeli far right, and also the embrace of Arab politicians who are essentially not interested in the Palestinian issue anymore. You write that that the U.S. needs to redouble its commitment to Israel's core security while promoting the two-state solution. And I wonder, from the vantage point of observing this from the region, whether the two-state solution is simply no longer on the table, and we're now in a one-state reality where the question is just what kind of one state is Israel going to be, and what kind of repercussions will that have on Israel's Arab neighbors as that political reality sets in?
Yeah, I agree with your analysis, Nasi. I think, as we've talked about the project with you and Michael and others, my sense of writing a piece like this is, let's just, it's not blue sky and it's not academic or hypothetical, but let's really kind of get what we think the policy is, get that right, and then, tailor it a little bit to the politics, figure out what your communication message is rather than the other. So nothing I write about, I believe Trump is prepared to do, but really is more saying, what really is the alternative to Trumpism, and moving it away from what's been sort of conventional wisdom, I think, of too many people. Your analysis of Israel, I guess my feeling is I am not about to bet my next non-subprime mortgage payment on a two-state solution, but I don't think anything else gets the word solution. I don't see how the Israelis impose a one state and in any way create sufficient security for, frankly, even for their own next generation, not to start immigrating, let alone what it requires them, the morale of the IDF, any sense of Israel's own morality, what it requires them to do to the people they occupy. That's not a solution. And the notion that somehow, well, let's make it all one state and do it by voting, that's not going to be a solution either, because there are people that believe, particularly after the Holocaust, whatever the historical debates about the Balfour Declaration, that the commitment of the international community to a Jewish state, was the right thing to do. And so I don't know that I argue that we should redouble our commitment. I think we should just make clear that, because again, as I said before, I think Obama and Kerry, lost whatever leverage they might have had by demonstrating that they wanted it, or Kerry at least wanted it more than Bibi did. So that's to me about the debate. The others may be outcomes. You may be right. That's where we're headed. But I don't see I don't see anything being a solution other than two-state. And at the same time, I put low probability on that. But if it's the only solution that's possible, my view is you got to keep trying to make it happen.
And that's why it makes a lot of sense that you've approached a lot of these problems in terms of how to manage them rather than how to look for clear resolutions. I've been talking with Bruce Jentleson at Duke University. Bruce wrote a report called Strategic Recalibration as part of the Century Foundation's Order from Ashes project. You can read it on our website at tcf.org. And if you want to know more about Bruce's thinking about how the U.S. can learn the lessons of the past and try and come up with a brighter strategy in the future, you can read his book that's coming out in April called The Peacemakers: Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship. Bruce, thanks for taking the time to come on the TCF World podcast.
Thanks very much. Good conversation.
TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about the work that TCF does, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.